Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So let's start our discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. In today's The Hindu newspaper, in the Delhi edition, there are a number of important articles. So I have chosen all the 11 topics that are relevant for the exam and we will cover them comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. But before we start, I have a couple of important announcements. Prelims aspirants would need as much practice as possible before the exam. So you have a right opportunity to practice a full length mock test, as Unacademy would be conducting the All India Prelims mock test on the 1st of March. So the question paper would be of UPSC standard and you would also get a All India rank. So those interested to attempt the full length mock test, please enroll by using the link provided in the video description below. Then as part of Conquer Prelims Phase 2, under which we are covering PYQ based MCQs. Today, I'll be taking up the third session for international relations at 6:30 p.m. So these classes, they are absolutely free for everyone. It's taking place on the Unacademy app. You can find the link in the description box, or you can go to the Unacademy app and search for the educator's name. Go to our profile page and click on the free classes tab where you can see these free classes scheduled. So this would be the last class for international relations at 6:30 p.m. today. So please don't miss the session. So after IR, we have other subjects coming and these classes will continue till 28th of February. So with this, let's get started and look at the first topic. On page number 6, The Hindu has published a column written by S.Y. Qureshi, the former Chief Election Commissioner of India. It's a very insightful article on the topic of women's reservation in the Lok Sabha and as well as in the state legislative assemblies. See, this has been a hot topic in our country from many years. Given that women are often not given equal opportunities to take part in political participation and to increase their political representation, they often have to pass through many hurdles, many challenges, which are posed by the society, by the orthodox nature of the society, by patriarchal systems, which look down upon women and oppress women. So the first ever women's reservation bill to provide for a dedicated number of reserved seats in the Lok Sabha and legislative assemblies was introduced back in 1996. But the bill never turned into an act because of repeated opposition or lapsing of the bill. And after numerous attempts, finally in 2023, there was a big milestone when the Women's Reservation Bill was turned into the Women's Reservation Act. So this gave a lot of hope for women candidates across the country, as it promised one-third reservation, 33% seats reserved in the Lok Sabha, in general elections, and across state legislative assemblies. So this was supposed to provide that much needed hope to provide for greater gender-based participation and ensure gender justice and provide for empowerment of women. But however, the implementation of this law is going to take its own sweet time. Because see, there are two necessary conditions to be fulfilled before the one-third reservation for women candidates can be implemented. Now, this is where the writer takes a critical view of the Women's Reservation Act and the deliberate political strategy to delay the implementation of women's reservation. You might think that once the law was passed and the required constitutional amendments were done, you might have assumed that the changes would have taken effect or it is likely to take effect very soon. But according to the writer, until the 2034 Lok Sabha elections, it is highly unlikely that women's reservation would be implemented. That is basically, it would be more than a decade since the law would be enacted. It would take almost like 11 years before you would see 33% reservation for women being provided in Lok Sabha in the general elections. That might happen only in 2034 Lok Sabha elections, not before that. So this is not just prediction or political speculation. This is a result of legal constitutional hurdles that have been deliberately put up in a way to delay the implementation of women's reservation. So that is exactly what the writer is examining here. We need to understand what are these hurdles and what solutions can be thought of to overcome these challenges. So there are two essential steps which have to be followed through in order to provide for women's reservation in Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies. Step number one, the Women's Reservation Act. It basically places the entire reservation process on the conduct of the next national census. The census conducted after 2026 is set as the minimum criteria for implementation of women's reservation. And as we know, the next census is now slated to take place in 2027. And census, as you know, is a time-consuming exercise. The enumeration part itself would take anywhere between 12 to 18 months minimum. If you look at the past experience, minimum of 12 to 18 months time is required for enumeration to be completed. Then after all the data is collected, it has to be processed, it has to be presented in an analytical form. So by the time the census report comes out, it would be at least 2029. If let's say enumeration begins in 2027, by mid 2028, most likely enumeration would be completed. Another few months time would be required to bring out the final report. And by the time the census report is published and tabled, it would be at least 2029 by then. Then after the census report comes out, the second mandatory step, a constitutional requirement, is the delimitation exercise to be carried out. Delimitation, which is provided under Article 82 of the Constitution, that provides for drawing up of the constituencies. So the President of India establishes a delimitation commission, and as per the census data and considering other factors as well, the delimitation commission draws up your electoral boundaries for the constituencies. It will take into account the population, the geographical compactness, administrative convenience, and also the reservation factor, reservation of seats for SC, ST candidates. And next, it would be reservation for women candidates as well. So by the time all these factors are accounted for and final delimitation is done, it would take a minimum of 3 years more. See, since independence, India has had 4 delimitation commissions. And if you look at the work of the first 3 delimitation commissions, it took a minimum of 3 years. If you look at the last delimitation commission that was set up in 2002, it took around 6 years because of increasing complexity of delimitation. And that too in 2002, the delimitation commission, it only had to carry out internal redrawing of boundaries within the states, which was a much easier exercise. But you know, the next delimitation commission, which might be constituted by 2029 or 2030, it will have one of the most difficult challenges in front of it, because it has to deal with the reallocation of seats amongst the states. The last such delimitation was done before 1976. And after that, the reallocation of seats among states was frozen until population stabilization could be achieved. Since states with higher population were getting more seats, it ended up creating a bigger divide between the north and the south states. States which were doing better with regard to family planning and population control, they would see their political representation reduce in the parliament. And those states which were not acting enough when it came to population control and stabilization, they were getting rewarded with more representation. So to avoid the mismatch and prevent the tensions and the regional divisions, from 1976, further delimitation was frozen and reallocation of seats was frozen till population stabilization could be achieved. So the next delimitation commission will have to deal with this. It will have to consider the expansion of Lok Sabha seats. Right now we have 543 Lok Sabha seats. This is to be significantly expanded to account for the changes in population profile. And the redistribution of seats among states will also have to be taken care of to ensure equitable representation for all the states. So population will not be the only criteria. Geographical compactness, administrative convenience, and the reservation criteria will all have to be factored in. And even if we assume that the next delimitation commission can do this within 3 years, even then, it would take at least until 2032 or 2033 to complete the delimitation process. So after this, the next Lok Sabha election is only in 2034. So that's why the writer confidently says that because of these legal, constitutional, and procedural hurdles which has been created in the Women's Reservation Act, the implementation of women's reservation will not take place until 2034. So this, according to S.Y. Qureshi, is a big miscarriage of justice. Reservation delayed is as good as reservation denied for women who have waited long enough. They account for nearly half the country's population, and they would be made to wait even more. Almost 11 years since the law was passed and came into effect. The implementation would take a very, very long time because of the difficulty which is created through this process. So that is exactly the criticism of the writer. The writer is pointing out that right now we have 543 parliamentary constituencies in the Lok Sabha. There are easily more than 4,000 state assembly seats. So imagine the time that is required for the delimitation commission to complete the entire exercise. Because in the next Lok Sabha, when the delimitation is taken up, we will see a significant expansion. Right now, estimates are indicating that in the Lok Sabha, we might see around 800 to 888 seats, a significant jump of at least 300 seats. So that itself adds a complex dimension to the delimitation exercise. Then upon that, you have to account for reservation for SCs, STs, and the new dimension, which is reservation for women. So completing such a challenging and complex exercise would minimum take 3 years for delimitation commission. So if next census happens in 2027 and the whole census process is completed by 2029, then delimitation commission is constituted, right? It will require minimum 3 years of work. That's a best case scenario. So worst case scenario, it could even extend beyond that. And who knows, the next actual implementation of women's reservation could be even beyond 2034. Maybe it could get pushed to 2039 for the next Lok Sabha election. So that is the fundamental problem being flagged by the writer. Now, was this unintentional? Was it just a procedural issue which has come up? Or does it appear to be a deliberate intent on the part of the political class to try and delay women's reservation as long as possible? That is the question the writer is trying to address. See, now, when you look at the current Lok Sabha, with 543 seats, imagine if one-third seats have to be reserved for women. How many seats would that be? It would be 181 seats. If 181 seats were kept aside for women, now where will the incumbent male politicians go? Right? They would not like to cede that space. They would not like to give up the current status that they enjoy. So right now, in the current Lok Sabha, the number of seats are limited. If one-third is reserved for women candidates, there is definitely that vested interest amongst the male political class across political parties, because they would not like to give up those seats for women, right? They would like to hold on to it, because if immediately delimitation was done, let's say delimitation is completely dealing from implementation of reservation. In that case, if 181 seats are given to women, it will lead to a replacement of those seats where the male political class would lose their political status. Probably this could be the vested interest which would have driven the political class to try and delay it by adding the condition of mandatory delimitation before providing for women's reservation. Because they know very well that in an expanded Lok Sabha, after that, when the next census is done and then delimitation is carried out, where Lok Sabha would be provided with additional seats in the range of 800 to 880 seats, then there is enough scope to accommodate the incumbent male political class and provide few new seats for women candidates. This seems to be the compromise that the political class is making, the male political class is making. And in the process, it will result in the delay of the implementation of women's reservation. So that is why the writer is strongly advocating to de-link delimitation from implementation of women's reservation. There is no necessity that delimitation is mandatorily required. There is a constitutional requirement now, but through an amendment, this can be removed. The same parliament which has placed this condition can get rid of this clause through a fresh amendment of the law and the constitution and de-link delimitation from implementation of women's reservation. If that is done, then there's nothing which can stop the parliament and the government to provide for the implementation immediately, starting with the subsequent state assembly elections and the next Lok Sabha election. Immediately, the women's reservation can be implemented, probably in an incremental manner if required. So that's what the writer is pushing for, that there need not be such a long delay. Because see, if the implementation of women's reservation is tied constitutionally to the delimitation and census exercise, there's one more problem which is going to come up. The North versus South division, which already is creating a complexity for delimitation exercise, it'll get even more complicated with the women's reservation aspect. So basically, you're linking gender justice with the issue of regional divide, and it will only increase the burden on the delimitation commission. That could end up delaying the exercise even further, right? So there is a fear amongst southern states which have controlled their population growth. They are worried that their representation might reduce, and states with higher population growth might be rewarded with more parliamentary seats. So this itself is already a complex issue that the next delimitation commission has to deal with. Upon that, if you're linking this with gender justice, you're increasing the complexity, making it even more difficult for the delimitation commission, which might even take 5-6 years to complete the exercise, which means women's reservation may not be even implemented in 2034 as well. It might get pushed to the 2039 Lok Sabha election. So that is why the writer is calling for the de-linking of the constitutional requirement. De-link delimitation from implementation of women's reservation, so that women's reservation can go on parallelly, independently. Let the census be completed, let delimitation happen on its own time. But that should not be holding back the implementation of women's reservation, according to the writer. Then there are other practical concerns which also have to be kept in mind. If seats are reserved for women candidates, right, the current law says that reservation would rotate between constituencies. So it will rotate in a certain cycle, in a cyclical manner. The 1/3 reservation would keep rotating between the different set of constituencies. But how would this be actually implemented on the ground is something which is not clear. This is something the Delimitation Commission and the Election Commission of India will have to clarify. So the writer is suggesting that the government, the parliament should work on these finer details, provide for immediate implementation by delinking delimitation from women's reservation. But for that, you would require an amendment. You would require a constitutional amendment to be done. And then it would be possible to implement women's reservation, probably in an incremental manner, so that the women candidates can immediately reap the benefits. And we can see a major jump in women's participation in politics and women's representation in the political setup. Now, let me know what's your view on this. Should the country hold and wait for almost 11 years after the law was passed? Or should women's reservation be implemented immediately by delinking delimitation from implementation of the reservation policy? Let me know in the comments. So this is your practice question for your mains. Based on what we have discussed, please write a structured answer by following those points that we discussed and try to practice your answer writing. Now let's move on to the next topic. On the same page, we have a column that focuses on global capability centers in India and how they have transformed the economic landscape in India. The writers are mainly talking about the GCCs. There are 1,800 GCCs in our country, and they have completely revolutionized the tech domain and the economic landscape of India. So, first, we need to understand what are these GCCs, Global Capability Centers. So, in simple words, GCCs are nothing but the tech SEZs and tech parks that you see across the tech hubs of India, from Bengaluru to Hyderabad to Noida, Gurugram, Pune, Chennai, all the major tech hubs that you see, right, where you find a cluster of multinational corporations functioning out of one facility. So, those centers are your global capability centers. So, this is where foreign multinationals operate and they try to leverage the advantages of a developing market like India. In a country like India, there are multiple advantages for a foreign MNC to set up office and operate their business out of here. There would be a significant cost advantage. They would be able to access cheap labor and highly skilled professional talent. They would also receive a lot of incentives, support, and benefits from the government. So that's why foreign MNCs often look at countries like India to set up these global capability centers where they outsource some of the tasks which are to be performed in low cost jurisdictions such as India, where the cost of operation would be low, where the labor cost is low, there is a huge talent pool available, skilled manpower readily available, with government support and incentives that is making the business easier. So, the first revolution of GCCs happened in India in the period of 1990s when India was opening up to the IT sector. But the initial set of GCCs that entered India were primarily in the space of business processing. Basically, they were just call centers. They were not doing some cutting edge research in India or developing some cutting edge software in India. Some of the initial foreign multinationals which set up GCCs in the country, they were mainly outsourcing routine and basic tasks such as customer support. And that led to the flourishing of BPOs and call centers across the country, where India basically became known as the back office of the world. In fact, even the term Bangalore became part of regular English vocabulary. That if someone lost their job, let's say in the US for outsourcing, right, the term Bangalore became a common term to be applied for that. So India was largely known as just a back end office running the basic routine tasks at a cheaper cost for these multinationals. But this wasn't really contributing to innovation and cutting edge research in India. But then came the next phase of GCC revolution, the true revolution in IT, in software services, where focus started shifting towards R&D and indigenous development of software products which could be sold across the world, which would have a global market. India started emerging as an innovation hub, and these companies started investing heavily in research and development and innovation. They would open R&D labs, they would fund research programs, and venture into cutting edge areas, including quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and today agentic AIs as well. So, this is the complete transformation that we have seen in the GCC landscape of India. And you need to credit the state governments and the central government for creating the right policies and the right support for attracting global capital, which led to the establishment of 1,800 global capability centers in India. Today, they employ more than 2 million professionals in the country, right? They provide employment for skilled labor, and it also provides for high paying jobs compared to other services industries in the services sector. If you look at the GCCs and the IT enabled services and the related tech industry, it primarily employs high skilled labor, provides high paying jobs, which increases the purchasing power, and it has a cascading effect on the Indian economy. It will lead to rise in real estate prices. It will trigger a lot of allied activities across the economy, boosting demand. And it has that domino cascading effect, which has benefited millions of people in the country. So today, the foreign MNCs which operate out of India, along with the Indian tech firms, They are focusing on cutting edge areas of research, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors, and as well as the development of agentic AI, where autonomous AI algorithms are being coded and developed and trained within India. So, this transformation would essentially project India as a leading hub of innovation and research and development, at least in the software and IT domain. And much of the credit goes to the GCCs, which were actively supported by few state governments, like the government of Karnataka, for example, or government of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, right? So today, there is a great opportunity for India to expand these GCC centers even towards tier 2, tier 3 cities and small towns as well. Because right now, some of the IT hubs in India, they're already oversaturated. You take Hyderabad, you take Bengaluru, Noida, Gurgaon, Pune, right? These are the traditional IT hubs of India, where most of your GCCs are located. So there is a need to move away from traditional IT hubs towards tier 2, tier 3 cities, which could bring about a similar transformation in other parts of the country as well. Maybe cities like Coimbatore or Mysuru, right? There's a lot of capability and resources available in different parts of the country to channel these efforts and investments to ensure the next phase of GCC revolution can kick in. But however, these tech companies and the global capability centers, they are facing many challenges and many hurdles. For example, today they are dealing with a very uncertain global market because of rising protectionism and the uncertain tariff policies of United States, the rising conservative trade policies and the ongoing trade wars. This creates a big difficulty because today governments are looking at weaponizing data and they are reasserting data sovereignty. Maybe going forward, US would not be comfortable to allow American tech companies to set up centers in India and shift data sovereignty under Indian control. They would use protectionist trade policies and punitive measures to deter American companies from investing in countries like India, and they might try to push the establishment of these centers back home in the United States. So, this would directly affect the investments in India's GCC space. So, rising protectionism is a big concern. Then, along with this, there are concerns with regard to cybersecurity. There is a massive surge in cyber attacks aimed at tech industries and the global capability centers. So, India today is handling around 13% of global cyber security incidents. Indian based companies or Indian based GCCs, they are currently handling around 13% of global cyber incidents. So, going forward, there would be a need to step up cyber security, and it would require collective efforts of the government and the private industry. Ensuring data safety, data security, ensuring the implementation of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, stepping up the data protection standards. This remains a big concern, and companies are struggling to still implement and enforce the provisions of the DPDP Act. So here, government will have to work with the private sector and ensure that we prioritize data safety and data security and implement the highest standards of cybersecurity. The other concern is tax related uncertainty. See, one reason why global MNCs invested in India's GCC centers was because of the tax benefits, the incentives and subsidies the government was providing. But now there is a global minimum tax under the OECD framework, which mandates a minimum 15% tax slab on such enterprises. Plus, in India, there is a 24% markup on software products, right? And only then, in that case, they enjoy the safe harbor provisions. So, right now, the tech companies in India, they're dealing with a significantly higher tax burden. And there's a lot of uncertainty as well regarding the taxation policies. So, simplifying the taxation related laws and providing for few benefits, few incentives, tax holidays could be a great incentive to initiate the next GCC revolution in India. Then also there is a gap in the talent that's available, the skilled workforce, the skilled labor force is not up to mark in India. Though India produces one of the highest number of engineers in the world, many of them lack industry experience. They lack the right skills that are needed to be, which makes them employable, right? And the talent gap, the skill gap is something which can be plugged only through better training, through upskilling. So there needs to be greater focus on industry and university collaboration. There should be greater focus in the higher education sector, where the priority is to inculcate practical industrial experience, which is needed for our students to finally seek out jobs and enter the job market. So, plugging the talent gap is as important as dealing with cybersecurity threats, tax related uncertainty, and even with regard to trade wars and protectionist policies of other countries. So, if these challenges can be overcome, then India could probably push towards the next GCC revolution, which could open up the space in critical emerging technologies for India, especially in the world of AI, quantum computing, semiconductors. That's where India can emerge as a leading global power. But for that, you need to attract more capital, and you need to push Indian players as well to invest more, and to ensure that the government needs to address these challenges. These four problem areas or problem statements will have to be solved. So please take up a practice question based on what we have discussed, and please use it for your answer writing practice. Now, moving on to the next topic. On page 7, there is a detailed column on the topic of freedom of speech that is enjoyed by MPs or members of parliament. The article is written by a very well known expert, a doyen when it comes to constitutional law and parliamentary affairs. It's written by PDT Acharya, the former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha. So, obviously, he brings that experience, that authority when he talks about the right to freedom of speech, which is to be protected for members of parliament as well. So, under Article 19, right to free speech is a guaranteed fundamental right. But of course, it's not an absolute right. It comes with a set of reasonable restrictions. Then, for MPs, for legislators, there are certain privileges granted under Article 105. There are few powers granted to the parliamentarians that includes the right to free speech on the floor of the House. This again is not an absolute right, of course. There are some reasonable restrictions on the free speech that is accorded to legislators and parliamentarians. So when you look at Article 105 that provides for these exclusive powers and privileges, it becomes clear that the MPs are empowered by the Constitution to talk freely, to debate, and bring out a fierce critique of the executive and hold the government accountable. That is the primary job of parliamentarians. Doesn't matter whether they are from opposition parties or ruling party. The job of any parliamentarian is to exercise this special privilege which is granted to them under Article 105 to engage in fierce debates on critical issues and protect public interest and hold the government accountable. That is the primary job of a parliamentarian. But today, we are seeing some disturbing developments in our parliament, particularly in the Lok Sabha, where a major clash has erupted between opposition parties and the speaker. For example, if you remember recent incidents involving Speaker Om Prakash Birla and opposition leader Rahul Gandhi, or let's say other opposition leaders like Mallikarjun Kharge, and how they have alleged that the current speaker is highly biased in favor of the ruling party and the government. So this brings up the question of the freedom of speech of the MPs, because Mallikarjun Kharge has alleged that the speaker has expunged most of his remarks from the speeches that he was delivering, thereby eroding the very role of the opposition in the parliament. Similar concerns were flagged by the opposition when the speaker ordered the expunging of entire statements made by Rahul Gandhi. So, this is what led the opposition eventually to push the motion for removal of the speaker itself. But of course, the speaker does have the right to expunge certain remarks that are made by parliamentarians. This is the power given to the speaker, which acts as a limitation on the freedom of speech, which is provided to the MPs under Article 105. So, to what extent do MPs enjoy free speech in the parliament? And in what cases, in what instances can it be curbed? Can it be restricted by the chairman of the house? That is something we need to understand. See, whenever rights are granted, of course, in any democratic setup, rights will never be absolute, right? There will be some reasonable restrictions. On some reasonable grounds, the rights can be restricted. But PDT Acharya makes a fantastic point. He says that when you're providing a set of rights, of course, restrictions will be there, but those restrictions can't be so excessive that it will end up destroying those rights. That is never the purpose of reasonable restriction. Reasonable restriction is meant as an exception, only for certain exceptional situations, only to deal with certain extremities. But if you misuse the reasonable restrictions and restrict the right, use the restrictions to restrict the right and kill the right itself, then that is undemocratic. So that is the core point being made by the writer here. So when you look at the exceptions that are there, see under Article 105, MPs do have the privilege of free speech. They exercise the right to free speech on the floor of the House, right? It's seen as a parliamentary privilege which is granted to parliamentarians. But there are several restrictions on the right to free speech. They can't speak anything, they can't say whatever they want, right? For example, if you look at rule number 380 of the rules of House of the Lok Sabha, if, let's say, someone is using unparliamentary language or offensive, explicit language, defamatory language, indecent, undignified language, of course, this can't be tolerated in a civilized setup, in a democratic setup. This could harm the very authority of the institution, the image of a high institution like the parliament, right? So, in the name of debate and criticism, you can't encourage any MP, doesn't matter whether they're from ruling party or opposition party, to be resorting to unparliamentary practices or resorting to defamatory speeches or even indecent, undignified words. If at all such remarks are made by a parliamentarian, then the speaker has the authority to expunge those words under the powers vested with him under rule number 380. But however, read this line again. It clearly mentions that the speaker has a right to expunge only those specific words. Let's say one MP used an undignified word or an unparliamentary word was used. Only those specific words, those specific remarks can be expunged. But right now, what we have seen is that the incumbent speaker has ordered the expunging of entire paragraphs, entire statements made by opposition leaders. That is not the purpose of Rule 380. Rule 380 is like a code of conduct, which is essential in the parliament to ensure that parliamentary proceedings are held in the right manner, to ensure it doesn't harm the image and the dignity of the parliament, the institution itself. So this is an extraordinary power the speaker should exercise with great caution. Only if certain undignified words are spoken, if defamatory words are used, unparliamentary language is being used, only those words, specific statements will have to be expunged. But we have seen instances where the incumbent speaker has been expunging entire speeches, entire paragraphs, just because the opposition is criticizing the government. That is not the essence of Article 105 and Rule 380. Now, there is another exception. If you look at Article 121, this restricts the free speech of parliamentarians. They can't essentially discuss the conduct of a judge of the higher judiciary unless and until there is a motion being considered for the removal of that judge. So parliamentarians cannot debate about the conduct of a High Court or Supreme Court judge unless and until there is a motion introduced calling for the removal of that particular judge. This again is to maintain the independence of the judiciary, to ensure that the parliament doesn't overstep the domain and erode the independence of the judiciary. Another restriction is that any matter which is sub judice, any matter which is still going through the litigation process in the courts, or questioning the bona fide of the other members, raising unnecessary personal allegations against fellow parliamentarians, or against ministers, or against party leaders, or making incriminatory allegations without giving any prior notice to the speaker. So such speech can also be curbed and restricted by the chairman, by the speaker of the house. But apart from this, all parliamentarians have a basic right to criticize the government, to question the policies of the government. So this could mean that opposition could openly criticize and question government ministers, including the prime minister himself. Because see, that is the job of the opposition, right? If the ruling party wants only praise, then there is no need for opposition in the parliament. The job of the opposition is to criticize, to condemn, as long as they are doing it in a dignified manner, without using unparliamentary language, following the basic rules of conduct, as long as they are not making baseless allegations targeting someone individually, then any form of opposition and criticism should be allowed on the floor of the house. That is the very core essence of a parliamentary democracy. So this is where the writer draws a parallel, a comparison with the first Parliament of India under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. He points out how then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru made it a point to take parliamentary proceedings very, very seriously. He would attend most of the sessions, sit hearing to the opposition, criticize his government, his ministers, and himself. He would rather encourage that as well, according to PDT Acharya. Because see, whatever is recorded in the parliamentary records, it serves a posterity purpose, right? When you look back, if future generations look back at parliamentary proceedings, right? And if they find that entire speeches and statements have been expunged, that doesn't give the complete picture about debates on important issues that took place in the parliament. So, according to PDT Acharya, Prime Minister Nehru then had a practice that he would not only add more answers to the answers being given by the ministers, sometimes he would even stand up and correct them, meaning the government was seeking to take accountability on the floor of the house and encourage active criticism from the opposition. And according to PDT Acharya, parliamentary records prove that Prime Minister Nehru was very open to direct criticism from the opposition, because he was someone who believed that party members would never criticize the leader, right? They would only praise and praise. If you want genuine reality, if you want the real picture on the ground, it only comes from the opposition, and that is the job of the opposition, which is to criticize. It could be a cabinet minister, it could be the prime minister himself. Criticizing is the basic function of the opposition, and that's the reason why they are called opposition in the first place. So just because opposition leaders are making uncomfortable statements or calling the government's actions and policies into question doesn't give the right for the speaker to expunge entire speeches and remarks. And that constitutes abuse of the powers which are granted. So that is the key point being highlighted by the writer. Now, moving on, we have an article on page number 12 that focuses on the usage of satellite communication and satellite phones in Indian territorial waters. See, this is an issue very closely linked to India's defense and security. When it comes to satellite communication, right, there are various kinds of devices, equipment, and technologies that are available. You have direct mobile devices which establish connection through satellites. There are messaging platforms available for which you can link your smartphones and use these satellite terminals to enable messaging as well. So there are several global companies which offer these satellite-based communication services. There are a few popular companies like Garmin, there's Inmarsat, there's Thuraya, there's Iridium, and many others. These are some of the popular vendors of satellite-based communication services. But the concern is with regard to satellite phones and satellite-based messaging and communication services and devices. Usually, these are foreign companies. They have no gateways in India. They have no land stations in India, which could make it hard to monitor the conversations, to intercept the conversations on security grounds. Right? It's very hard to intercept such communication. And on national security grounds, India has very tightly restricted, and in some cases, India has even banned specific types of satellite communication from being used in Indian territory. So, on India's landmass, it's easy to enforce these regulations and restrictions because it's a known fact that satellite based communication is often used by intelligence operatives of hostile countries or even by terrorist groups or sometimes even by organized criminal organizations posing a direct national security threat. So, as a result, the government of India, through the Department of Telecommunication, enforces a very strict regulation and even ban on different types of satellite communication. But now it has been reported that most of the ships which are entering Indian waters, the crew members are carrying such satellite devices for communication and using it in Indian waters, though it is banned or tightly regulated. See, under the existing rules, which are enforced by the Directorate General of Shipping, the DGS, once a foreign vessel is entering Indian water, if they are carrying any satellite communication equipment, they have to report this immediately to the Indian authorities and they can't use it. They even have to hand it over so that the Indian authorities can seal the devices and later give it back to them when they are leaving India. But sometimes these protocols are violated. The crew members don't often report the satellite devices they are carrying and using, and they continue to use it in Indian waters without taking required permissions. To use any form of satellite communication in India, you need explicit licensing from the Department of Telecommunication. As I said, most satellite services are banned in India and some are tightly regulated. Only DOT is authorized to give that license. So, on the seafarers, there are very strict regulations that once they enter Indian waters, they can't use the devices. They need to report the devices they are carrying to Indian authorities, and Indian authorities will seal them and hand it over back to them. So, they can't use it when they are in Indian waters and in Indian territory. Is that clear? So, since the reports have come that many seafarers are using satellite communication in Indian waters, the concerns have been flagged, and the DGS, the Directorate General of Shipping, has issued fresh guidelines to seafarers that if they violate the provisions, they could be penalized. They could even face arrest for violation of Indian law. But however, distress systems, as per the Global Maritime Distress and Safety Systems, these are communication systems which can be used only in times of distress. Let's say the ship is stranded or they are facing a accident, right? Only to raise an alert and request for assistance for search and rescue. The distress systems can be activated and used. But this has to be integrated with the ship's communication systems. So personal devices of the seafarers is banned explicitly by India. If at all they are carrying it, they should report it to Indian authorities and they can't use it when they are in Indian waters. But Indian agencies, intelligence agencies have found multiple violations and hence renewed orders have been given with tight regulations to provide for strict enforcement of these guidelines. Is that clear? Now let me give you one assignment. There is one intelligence agency in India which specializes in intercepting all forms of communication, be it mobile based internet or the entire internet traffic and mobile communication, including even satellite communication, can be intercepted by one particular intelligence agency of India. Can you find out which is this intelligence agency? Mention the name of this agency in the comment section below. Right? There is one particular agency that specializes in intercepting communication intelligence and generating technical intelligence. So it has the capability to intercept satellite communication as well. Clear? So please find out which agency is this. Now coming to the next topic, the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, right? He has made a very interesting statement. We've already covered India-Brazil relations in the last two classes. We even spoke about the key agreements and deals that were signed. But there's just one point I would like to bring up. Lula da Silva has called upon all the countries of Global South to unionize, like how trade unions, labor unions, worker unions are formed, right, in factories to stand up against the factory management and increase their collective bargaining power. Similar strategy is being suggested by Lula da Silva to deal with global hegemons like United States. Because see, just like India, Brazil also faces 50% tariffs, right? And given the current protectionist environment and the hegemonic tendencies of global powers like US and others, the Brazilian president has correctly pointed out that small countries, when they are negotiating individually or bilaterally with big powers, they will always end up losing. Small countries that negotiate with a big power will obviously end up losing because they don't have the bargaining power. They don't have any leverage that they can use in these bilateral negotiations. So, only way in which small powers can protect their interests is to act collectively, which is to unionize. So, this again is a call for global south to shape the multilateral world order, to retain the relevance of multilateralism by acting as a collective group to increase the bargaining power of the weaker countries, the developing, underdeveloped nations. This exactly aligns with India's foreign policy objectives. India believes in a multilateral, multipolar world order, and India believes in creating that diplomatic space in negotiations. So, on most important global issues, we create this collective power by working with the global south, by working with African countries, small Asian powers, Latin American countries, etc. And this has been a strategy of India's foreign policy from a long time. And the idea of unionizing, almost like a trade union or a workers' union, it comes for Lula da Silva naturally because he himself rose in Brazilian politics as one such leader of a workers' union, right? It's basically part of his political experience. Then there's another interesting anecdote that Lula da Silva has mentioned while he was in India. He was calling upon the UN to reform itself and provide permanent seats to the deserving countries like India, a country with 1.4 billion population. Not having a permanent seat at UNSC doesn't make any sense, right? Remember, we spoke about the G4 yesterday and day before. How India, Brazil, Germany, Japan together are collectively pushing for reforms of UN and calling for a permanent seat. So he called for a permanent seat even for Africa, which is completely unrepresented. He mentioned countries like Mexico, Nigeria, Egypt, which are all deserving of having greater representation at the UN. So while talking about this, he mentioned a very interesting anecdote. He spoke about a key lesson in economic management that he learned from India. The year was 2005 when he was visiting India under then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Lula da Silva was a great friend of Manmohan Singh and they had built a very good personal equation between the two sides. So Lula da Silva learned how India had amassed huge forex reserves, hard currency reserves, to the tune of $100 billion back then, which was helping Indian economy tide over any global crisis. This is something Brazil had not done. Brazil was largely a debtor country, borrowing from IMF time and again. So, following this experience that he learned from Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and from India, he realized the importance of building up the forex reserves with hard currency reserves. And today, Brazil holds a massive $360 billion reserve, and it's no longer a debtor country from IMF, it's a creditor country to IMF. It's contributing funds to the IMF today. So he credited India for teaching that lesson in economic management. How important it is for middle powers like India, Brazil to build up their forex reserves with hard currency reserves to stand up in global politics or in global political order. Next, a very big development with regard to India's fight against Naxalism. See, India has set a target. Prime Minister Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah have set a goal to eliminate Naxalism by March 2026. Naxal Mukt Bharat is one of the most important security goals that has been set by the Modi government. And India is very close to achieving this unthinkable target. Full credit goes to the current government, which has been working very proactively with the state governments to eliminate the remaining strands of Naxalism in the country, which had once been labeled as India's biggest internal security challenge. So we have seen how many top Naxal leaders have been neutralized, killed in counterinsurgency operations, and how Maoist leaders and cadres have been surrendering in large numbers. So the other day, one of the top Maoist leaders has surrendered, making it one of the biggest milestone events in our fight against Naxalism. The incumbent general secretary of the CPI Maoist, known by his alias Devji, his actual name is Tipiri Tirupati. He's primarily from the Telangana, Andhra Pradesh region. Uh, he was, as a student, very actively involved in left wing extremist radical activities in the 1980s. And he eventually became part of the People's War Group, the PWG, which was the branch of Naxalism in the Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Odisha belt. Right? Later, the PWG would merge with the MCCI, the Maoist Communist Center of India, which was mainly operating in the Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal belt. And they formed CPI Maoist in 2004, which is the current Naxal outfit that's operating in India. Right? So Devji goes back to the PWG era, which was a major menace, a security menace in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana belt back in 1980s and 1990s. So Devji quickly rose up the ranks. He went on to play a critical role in the formation of the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army, the armed branch of the PWG, which was known for notorious attacks against the security forces. Later, he rose within the CPI Maoist. He became a member of the Central Committee. He later became a member of the Politburo Standing Committee. And now he was considered as the incumbent head of the CPI Maoist, the General Secretary himself. Because last year, the then General Secretary, Nambala Keshav Rao, was killed by Indian security forces in a landmark encounter where the top leader was eliminated by our security forces. So this position of Nambala Keshav Rao was taken over by Devji Tipri Tirupati, and he was considered as the acting General Secretary of the CPI Maoist. So his surrender is indeed a big milestone. The very leader of Naxalism has surrendered with many other top leaders, including Malla Raji Reddy, who has been responsible for many major attacks against the security forces. So this clearly marks the decline of Naxalism. Naxalism is on its last breath. Many senior leaders have surrendered across states from Maharashtra to Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha. Many top leaders have already surrendered. Their entire cadres have laid down their arms. So most likely the government is going to achieve the target, right? Almost the entire ground network of Naxalism is being eradicated. And once India becomes Naxal free, by and large, that would be one of the biggest security achievements for India in terms of its internal security. Because Naxalism, which broke out in 1967, has remained one of India's biggest internal security nightmares. An insurgent movement which has lasted decades, for it to be wiped out with elimination of ground support would indeed mark a big success for the government. And this has come not just through security operations. Security operations have been matched with developmental efforts to address the governance problems which had alienated the people, the farmers, the peasants, the tribals, who were initially backing the Naxal movement. So today, better governance and better administration and development has weaned that popular support away from Naxalism. And that's one of the prime reasons why today Naxalism is on its last lap. Right? So let's wait and watch for a few more days. There would be probably a big announcement which will be made by the government. A proper status report would be given, which will help us understand whether India has achieved the goal or not. But going by the track record, it's very, very clear that India is likely to declare itself as free from Naxalism by the end of next month. Next, fresh clashes have broken out between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and this is something which could affect regional stability and security. See, recently there have been a spate of terror attacks in Pakistan. Some have been claimed by Islamic State. Some have been claimed by the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So Pakistan blames these attacks on Afghan Taliban for sheltering the TTP. It even blames India for sponsoring the TTP, though it has never presented any evidence to show those links. And it keeps on denying its own role in breeding and backing extremism, which today is culminating in the violence that Pakistan is facing internally. Right? It's convenient for Pakistan to blame external powers like India or Afghanistan. Right? So Pakistan has been targeting some of the terror havens of TTP and ISIS that's located across the Durand line. So inside Afghanistan, right, there are few eastern provinces like Nangarhar, Paktika, where terror sanctuaries are believed to be present for TTP, ISIS, and the others. And Pakistani armed forces have conducted massive airstrikes, and Pakistan claims it has killed 70 militants. But Afghan Taliban has rejected the allegations and it has objected to the airstrikes, calling it a major violation of its sovereignty. The locals in eastern Afghanistan have said that those who have been killed are local villagers who are civilians and they were not involved in terror activities. So, one thing is clear, the flare up between Pakistan and Afghan Taliban is likely to continue. Afghan Taliban considers the TTP, the Pak Taliban, as a related organization, sort of a brother organization. And given the differences that have increased and emerged between the Pakistani deep state and Afghan Taliban, it has been more convenient for Afghan Taliban to provide some sort of backing and support to Pak Taliban and shelter them across the border, as both groups are made up of the Pashtuns who are found across the Durand line. So this issue is blowing up day by day, and the further divide between Afghan Taliban and Pakistan could even create opportunities for India, as India is opening up to the Afghan Taliban regime. But however, the rising incidents of terrorism, extremism, radicalism inside Pakistan remains a major concern for India as well, right? Because any potential threat to the very existence of the Pakistani state would be a major concern, a security risk for India. So this is one development that you should be aware of, because we saw such clashes last year as well, where Pakistan carried out such blatant airstrikes and cross-border raids into Afghan territory, and Afghan Taliban even retaliated and delivered a significant blow to the Pakistani army. So it led to serious border clashes last year, and these tensions are continuing in 2026 as well. Now, coming to the prelim section, let's take a quick look at the small articles in the newspaper today. On page number 8, we have an article related to security and science and technology. This article is related to the topic of nuclear safety and radiation management. This article will help you understand the current global framework and global standards when it comes to radiation management and nuclear safety. There are two specific terms, scientific terms, that you need to understand here. One is the LNT model, linear no threshold model, and the other principle is the ALARA principle. So what is this ALARA principle and what is this LNT model and why is it in news? See, recently, United States under President Trump has issued a new set of radiation safety standards through the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy in the US, which deals with nuclear safety, radiation safeguards, it has pushed for reforms in the nuclear sector and it has tried changing the global standards which are followed. The US government is basically trying to remove this LNT model and the ALARA principle. So, what is this LNT model? LNT stands for linear no threshold model. What does it mean? It means that when it comes to ionizing radiation, any form of radioactivity, no threshold is applicable there with regard to endangerment of human safety. Even the slightest exposure to radiation, ionizing radiation, can be deadly. It could not only lead to cancer, it could have many non-cancer effects as well. Now, let's say when you take any hazardous substance, right, there will be some threshold until which exposure is acceptable. It's still considered as within safe limits. Let's say you take a dangerous chemical or a dangerous toxin, right? Until a certain threshold, there are certain safety thresholds established by World Health Organization and other global institutions. If exposure is within that limit, within that threshold, then the exposure is considered as safe, right? Which means you can even industrially use some of those hazardous substances and materials if you take certain precautions. But when it comes to ionizing nuclear radiation, there is no threshold which is safe for humans. This is the gold standard in nuclear safety and radiation safety. This is codified. It has been codified by the International Commission on Radiological Protection. It's a global body, the ICRP, which lays down radiation safeguards and standards and protocols to deal with nuclear safety and radiation hazards. According to the International Commission on Radiological Protection, there is no amount of safe exposure. Even the slightest minimum exposure to ionizing radiation can be disastrous for human health. It can cause cancer or other non-cancer effects. This is your LNT model. There is no threshold which is safe for humans. And what is the meaning of linear? Linear means if exposure increases, the risk also increases in a linear manner, which is like a direct proportion, right? There is a direct proportionality link. When a human being is exposed to any amount of radiation, the risk also keeps on increasing in the same linear proportionality. So that is your LNT model, which has been the governing framework for radiation safety across the world. This is exactly the standard India also follows. That when it comes to ionizing radiation, humans should have zero exposure. Even the slightest exposure is considered risky. That's why the no threshold model. Linear model means if radiation exposure increases, your risk also increases linearly. So this is the gold standard when it comes to radiation safety. Now, Donald Trump is trying to remove this, get rid of it, just to focus on nuclear projects. Now, what is the ALARA principle? ALARA principle, it stands for as low as reasonably possible. This is another gold standard principle when it comes to radiation safety. It's an acronym. It stands for as low as reasonably possible. Now, we humans work with nuclear material and ionizing radiation, right? In the nuclear energy sector, nuclear weapons, and all the industrial applications of radioactive material, there is a certain degree of human exposure involved, right? Now, according to LNT model, there is no radiation limit which is considered as safe. Even the slightest exposure is hazardous and harmful. But however, when it comes to any nuclear involvement or project, right, where humans are interacting with nuclear material, getting exposed to radiation, it should be kept as low as reasonably possible. That is the ALARA principle, which means when you're constructing a project, building a plant, or handling radioactive substances and material, utmost care and precaution has to be exercised to keep that exposure to the minimum possible level. This is the driving principle for nuclear safety and radiation management. Now, US is getting rid of both these concepts. It's removing the LNT model and the ALARA principle in the name of reforms to the nuclear sector to give a fillip to the nuclear market. But this could compromise safety standards and regulatory standards, and it could increase human exposure to harmful, hazardous radiation in the United States. Coming to the next topic, on the last page, the Hindu has published a spectacular image captured by the James Webb Space Telescope. You can see the Helix Nebula captured over here. So, what's a nebula and what is so special about the Helix Nebula? The Helix Nebula is approximately located 650 to 700 light years from Earth. Relatively, it's quite close to Earth, right, in cosmic distance terms. And it's one of the nearby bright planetary nebula in the Aquarius constellation. And it's also referred to as the Eye of the God because of its spectacular appearance. It looks like the eye, the human eye. It's often referred to as the eye of the God because of its striking similarities with a human eye, right? So it's this nebula which has been captured in a spectacular manner by the James Webb Space Telescope. Now, what is a nebula? See, a nebula is essentially a luminescent part of interstellar medium. It's a collection of dust, ionized material, molecular hydrogen, and other cosmic substances which collectively makes up a nebula, and it has this natural irradiance or natural luminescence attached to it. It naturally glows in a way. If you have seen the famous pillars of creation, right, the three standing pillars of cosmic dust and star forming material, right? So that essentially is a nebula which has this natural luminescence attached to it because of all the composition which it is made up of. Now, these nebulas or nebulae, as it is called in plural, it is considered as a star forming region. It's eventually this cosmic matter which will fuse together to give birth to stars. And whatever remnants are left behind, that will end up forming planets and planetary systems around these stars. Is that clear? Next, on page 14, we have an article referring to a territorial dispute involving South Korea and Japan. I'm sure all of you would have heard about the maritime and territorial dispute between China and Japan, which is over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, that's located over here between Taiwan and Japan. So, this dispute that we have, the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute between China and Japan, this is in the East China Sea. So, similarly, there is a dispute between South Korea and Japan in the Sea of Japan. In the Sea of Japan, there is this island called Takeshima. That's the Japanese name for it. Japan claims this island and it's known by a Japanese name, Takeshima. Whereas South Koreans also have a claim on it. In South Korea, it's referred to as the Dokdo Island. So Japan has recently marked an event called Takeshima Day at the Shimane Prefecture. This is part of the Shimane Prefecture archipelago of islands present here. So South Korea has criticized Japan for marking this event, and it has brought back the territorial dispute between the two allies. South Korea and Japan are considered as allies, both allied with United States. But they do have a standing territorial dispute over the Takeshima Dokdo Island. Takeshima is the Japanese name, Dokdo is the South Korean name. Then coming to the last topic for today, Russia has carried out deadly airstrikes using missiles and drones aimed at Ukraine's critical infrastructure. See, this has been Russian strategy over the last decade. Since 2014, since annexing Crimea, and especially after invading Ukraine in 2022, Russia has always targeted the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. They've even used cyber attacks to cripple power supplies and basic public services, from transportation to banking to power and water distribution. They've also carried out targeted strikes using missiles and drones aimed at power grids, even rail infrastructure, water supply and distribution lines. They have been specifically targeted. So this shows the nature of today's warfare, how countries primarily take aim at critical infrastructure of a country. Now, the article also mentions something very important for our prelims exam. It makes a mention of the Druzbha oil pipeline. See, the Druzbha pipeline is in news because right now the European Union is considering fresh set of sanctions against Russia to punish Russia for the Ukraine war, right? But in this proposed sanction by the European Union, one of its member, Hungary, is opposing the sanctions and it's not willing to support the new EU sanctions on Russia. See, the Hungarian leader is known to be very close to Russian President Putin. And Hungary has always been placing roadblocks for EU and NATO and trying to show some favor towards Russia. Right now, Hungary has said it will not support EU sanctions on Russia unless and until Ukraine allows oil to be transported by reopening the Druzhba pipeline. That's the condition of Hungary, that Ukraine should reopen the Druzhba pipeline, ensure oil supplies flow through again from Russia to Hungary. Only then they will support the sanctions of EU on Russia. So what is this Druzhba oil pipeline? This is one of the major energy networks and corridors located in Eastern Europe. It mainly carries Russian oil. The pipeline passes through Ukraine, as you can see here, and distributes Russian energy through the network to multiple European countries. It will distribute this into the Baltic region, into Central and Eastern Europe, and also towards the Balkan region. So multiple European countries are dependent on the Druzhba oil pipeline network, which is mainly based out of Ukraine. So because of the war, the pipeline has been disrupted. Ukraine has shut the supplies to prevent Russian oil from reaching European markets. Of course, European countries are looking to stay away from Russian energy as much as possible. But Hungary wants to continue the dependency and it's pressurizing Ukraine basically to reopen the pipeline so Russian oil can flow to Hungary. So that's why the Druzhba oil pipeline network can be very important for the exam. So on this note, I bring the analysis to an end. If you found the session to be insightful and useful, do let me know in the comments, press the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That's it. Thanks for watching.